My name's Bill Bandy. I'm a geologist for Pioneer Oil Company in Vincennes, Indiana, and I live right across the river in Lawrence County, Illinois. They asked me to tell you about coring today. I'll start with a silly little illustration of coring because I think it's something that you would understand and certainly your students would relate to. Something you probably did as a kid, maybe you still do it as an adult. Okay. Have you ever taken a straw and rammed it into ice cream? Admit it, you've done that, right? You pull the straw out, what have you got? Straw full of ice cream. Okay, core barrel works in a very similar fashion. Okay, if we're drilling and we think we know where we're at underground, we're drilling, we think at a certain depth we've got a reservoir and we want to get an actual rock sample of that reservoir. Now you'll see one station, if you haven't already, that Stephanie mans that drills samples, which is ground up rock, which is okay. I mean, we can work with that, but having the real rock's a lot nicer. Well, we reach that point in depth, we will pull the drill string out of the hole, take the bit off, attach what they call a core barrel. It's a hollow barrel with a bit on the end, anywhere from 20 to 30 feet long. So imagine this, only 30 feet of it in length, okay? And then we'll go back downstairs to the bottom of the hole, and that bit, they'll start to turn that core barrel, and the bit will cut like this around it, and the rock will come up into the barrel. It's designed in such a way as once it goes up, it can't come back out, and we'll cut until we think we've got a full barrel, and then they'll bring it back up to the surface. It stays in as long as that bit's on inside that barrel. And I've been out on core a lot of times. What they'll do is the drillers and the crew will hang that barrel about this far above the rig floor. And one thing they don't do is stick their hand under there because that's 30 feet of hard, weighty rock, okay? And they will take that bit off and then the rock starts to fall down. This guy will take what looks like a huge salad tong, grab it, pull it out, of course it keeps falling down, and then by a process with the rig hands, we will take that out on the gangplank, which is 40 feet long. It's got a gutter or a tray in the middle. We'll lay all that rock back out, put it all back together, and then I'll go along and I'll mark it every foot from top to bottom and an arrow pointing which way is down. And then I will describe it very quickly, mark the samples we want. Usually a lab tech is there from a core lab. He will take those samples. I think currently we do plastic sleeves to try to preserve the fluid in them. They used to do dry ice decades ago. And then we ship it all off to a lab to be analyzed, to get information about that reservoir underground. So that's kind of a quick explanation. There's 4 things we want to know about this rock. Sometimes we gather additional information depending on the sophistication and how much money you want to spend. But the basics are porosity, permeability, oil saturation, and water saturation. Those are important parameters for us to know about that reservoir. Porosity is just how much empty space is inside that rock. Now, if you look at something like this, you think, not much, but you'll also notice it's very dark. This thing was oil saturated when it was pulled. Probably on the outside, when they pulled the core out, it was probably just oil everywhere, oozing. You look at that and think, this is a sandstone, and I'm willing to bet probably at least 20% empty space. You can't see it, but it's there. Limestones can get ridiculous in terms of empty space. The next parameter is permeability. There's a rather windy definition there on that paper of permeability. You've seen these. They're like textbook definitions, and then you have to explain to your students what that means in plain English. I understand that. But basically, how well does that rock transmit a fluid? How well will fluid move through that rock? Does it move easily? Is it very hard to get out? It's pretty much determined by the connections between those pore spaces. And you've all walked through porosity and permeability. It's called a cave tour. You've all done it, I'm sure. That's one of the common things. You walk through porosity and permeability. The other thing is they always turn the lights off to tell you how dark it is, as if you couldn't figure that one out. But if you've been in like those large cave rooms, walking in a nice big room, there's your pore space. Then you had to go through Fat Man Squeeze, they call it, that real narrow chamber to get to the next room. There's your pore throats in between the chambers. That's your permeability part right there. How easy is it to get from one pore space to the next? Is it wide open, very narrow, something in between? It's a mathematical measurement. The value is called a Darcy. That's mentioned there on the handout. And those numbers mean nothing without that little explanation there at the bottom of the page. With these rocks, it's millidarcies, and if you're below 10 millidarcies, it's probably a lost cause. You're not going to get much fluid out of that rock. 10 to 100, you're getting into a range where we can probably work with it possibly. Past 100 millidarcies should be fairly good reservoir rock. It transmits fluid well enough between those pore spaces that we can pump it and get the fluid out. Largest I've ever seen was crazy, 15,000 darcies. That was in a limestone. I thought, good grief, you could drive a truck through this thing almost. So that's an example. Porosity and permeability are rock parameters. The other two are oil saturation, how much oil did we get out of there, and how much water did we get out.
Where was that largest?
That was actually in Lawrence County, Illinois, in the St. Genevieve limestone. It's what they call an oolitic limestone. It had incredible porosities approaching 30%, and then the connections were just unreal. You'll notice too, and I provided for you here, this is how we see the data. This is one example of what comes back from the laboratory. The raw mathematical data, and then some type of graph representation of that data. This is typically what we see coming back. Porosity, permeability, oil and water saturation. Sometimes you will get additional data like vertical permeability or grain density or things like that as well. You can do a lot more with these cores. It just boils down to how expensive do you want to make this. But those four parameters are the basics. Interesting thing about oil and water saturation, you would think, okay, it's full of fluid, so it adds up to 100%, right? Nope. Doesn't add up. If you add oil and water on a lot of this, it doesn't add to 100%. Where'd the fluid go? Well, you're losing fluid from the minute you pulled out of that barrel. So it's not a perfect science. They are estimates at best of what's going on. And you look for trends and you look for changes in that oil versus water saturation. I love putting this data into Excel spreadsheets because then you can really do some things with this information. And that's what goes on with these next couple of charts here. This core was taken over 60 years ago, the Paul Baum number 2. I picked this because this is a great textbook example of a core. And most cores are not perfect, and most cores are not good textbook examples, but this one just happened to be. This was taken in a gas storage field up in Crawford County, Illinois, back in the early 1960s. And what I've done here is just chart the oil and the water saturations. You can see the water line, it's blue, the oil line, it's black, and it moves around. There's some changes going on. But then this is where Excel's nice. I took the oil saturation and divided it by the water. What's the ratio between the two? And then you see some real changes. That's the red line. You didn't see much in the top of the core, and I'm willing to bet when they pulled it, they probably saw some oil bleeding out, but then there's like almost no oil at all. What is that? That's the gas cap. You usually don't see all three layers in a core, because in a perfect reservoir, you got a gas cap with the oil underneath and the water on the bottom. In this core, that's why it's textbook. It just happened to show all three. That top part's the gas cap, and where the red line and the black line come way out and the water recedes, there's your oil reservoir right there for a few feet. The red line's the most dramatic, and you can see it drop back very quickly. There's your water at the bottom. So this is like the Excel spreadsheet version of the perfect core or the perfect reservoir structure. The other one was just a plot, same core, porosity and permeability. This is typical. This is very typical. You notice the porosity doesn't vary much at all there, but boy, the permeability is all over the place. And this is normal in most rocks. It's because they've been subjected to what we call diagenesis. It's everything that happens to those sediments after they're deposited and hardened into rock. And I mean, they've been down there for millions and millions of years and subject to a lot of changes. Most of those changes are created by the fluids that happen to move through them over the eons of time. And I mean, down deep, they all have fluid in them of some sort. It could be salt water, because we're looking for the oil, we don't want the salt water, but as those fluids move through over the eons of time, they affect that porosity and permeability, especially if they're saturated and something precipitates out of those fluids. They can plug up the porosity, they can plug up the permeability. They will definitely change the rock in that regard. And fluid underground is just like fluid on the surface. Where does water go on the surface? Downhill. Why? It's the easiest route. Where does fluid go underground? Well, in this case, in the direction of least pressure or through the areas of highest permeability, and they pick those routes and they move through, and they may actually lower that permeability over time because stuff precipitates out of those fluids and starts to plug up those spaces a little bit. And so this kind of reflects a diagenetic history of where fluid might have gone and plugged things up, and so you got this very erratic permeability pattern. Pretty normal. Sandstones can be somewhat erratic. Limestones can be even worse because they quite often have erratic porosity and permeability in the first place, and you know that again if you've ever walked through a cave. I wish I'd bought it. I saw it when my kids were little. We took them to Mammoth Cave, and they had this three-dimensional block diagram of all the cave passages. It's a cool looking three-dimensional block. It also looked like a bad hair day times 10. It's just all over the place. It was a mess. But that's probably the reality of these rocks as well. That's what porosity and permeability looks like in these rocks, just on a much smaller scale. So that's pretty much coring. Oh yeah, come on up, take a look, handle them, and grab a piece from in here.